Hi, it's Matt Thomas, back again with Sonic Academy, and we're here to look at the Arturia V. That's the sound of the graphic coming in now. There you go. And just over my left shoulder, you can see another Synthi VCS3, because this is the machine that started it, the archetype for all the Synthis that followed. So what we're going to do, first of all, before we get to grips with Arturia's software, is we're going to have a quick chat about the history of EMS, the company that made it. If you're not here for the history, this will be painfully dull, because I do like my history. But if you're curious to know where this machine came from, what the ideas behind it are, and why it exists, then stay here. We're going to learn. The EMS story starts back in 1963, but at that time, it wasn't really a company or even an idea. It begins with a man called Peter Zinoviev. Now, Peter Zinoviev, as the name suggests, was the son of Russian immigrants to this country, coming over here, bringing their electronically gifted children. Anyway, that was why he was here, and he married into a wealthy family. Not the whole family, that would be greedy. But he married their daughter, and the family in question owned most of the home counties. So he was a man with the money to pursue hobbies. And his hobby, as I say, was electronic music, which didn't really exist at the time, so it was quite an ambitious hobby. So he began making his own kit. Everybody in that time, in the 1960s, had to make their own kit. You couldn't buy anything, so you'd go and build your own oscillator, maybe build your own filter, wire these things together, and create your own instruments. Although instruments, as an idea, wasn't really what these guys were after. They didn't like the idea of something you could play. They were organs. If you want to play dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, get an organ. These guys were interested in the kind of atonal, random, unheard textures and tones. So if you hear any of the early 60s electronic music, you're not going to hear something very catchy. Some of the other very few people interested in that were working for the BBC at the Radiophonic Workshop. So Zinoviev hooked up with Delia Derbyshire and Brian Hodgson to make a band called Unit Delta Plus. They did performances as well as recordings. It didn't last long before there was a stylistic split between Zinoviev and the two Radiophonic Workshop people, and this is occasionally put down to Zinoviev being a bit more kind of left field. He had amazing ideas at all times. The problem was his ideas were far ahead of the technology available, so it was incredibly lucky that he found this guy called David Cockerell in 1966. Now, David Cockerell, without being in any way rude, is the grommet to Peter Zinoviev's Wallace, because Zinoviev has insane ideas, absolutely ridiculous ideas, and Cockerell, unbelievably, makes them work. For example, and most notably, one of the first things David Cockerell did was work out that the problem that Zinoviev had with controlling his oscillator banks would best be fixed if he had a computer. And that's a great idea, unless it's 1967. Because at that time, people didn't own computers. Universities owned computers, businesses might own a computer, like a whole bank, like not just like your branch, but the whole bank might own a computer. But luckily, Zinoviev was rich, and certainly his wife was definitely rich. So rather obligingly, she sold her tiara to buy him a computer. And I know that, like Zinoviev, and I'm sure yourselves as well, my wife loves selling her crowns whenever it's time for me to buy a new computer. So they got this PDP-8, this amazing personal computer, and wired it up and wrote the software required and had it controlling these oscillator banks. So this became what was known as MUSYS, M-U-S-Y-S. Now, by 1968, Cockerell, Zinoviev, and the third member of the soon-to-be EMS, Tristram Carey, another home DIY electronic building, music-making whiz, slightly more practical than Zinoviev, still very avant-garde. He makes a bridge, I guess, between Zinoviev, who's dreaming ideas from the future, and Cockerell, who's trying to actually make these things happen. So eventually the money does start to run out, and at that point, by necessity rather than intention, the guys at EMS are starting to think, I guess it would be a way to make money, quite a new idea, because they were burning through it at a pretty impressive rate by all accounts. A way to make money might be to sell some of these things we're inventing. So this idea occurs to them. Unfortunately, while they're mulling this over, an Australian guy called Don Banks turns up, and he says, wouldn't it be handy, if instead of having to build all this stuff as we're all doing by hand, component by component, circuit by circuit, if somebody just made a nice selection of things like a filter, an oscillator and so on, and put them all together into a kind of an instrument that people could just buy. And so Zinoviev took this discussion he'd had with Banks back to Cockerell, and Cockerell quickly produced what is now referred to generally as the Don Banks Music Box, or sometimes the VCS1. Many of the features are going to be familiar from the VCS3, but the kind of more complicated trapezoid envelope hadn't appeared yet. This had a simple attack and decay, and probably most notably the patch matrix with the pins. That hadn't turned up either. I've been lucky enough to see the original Don Banks box when I was over in Sydney. It's in the Powerhouse Museum if you're ever in Australia, apart from enjoying the amazing food, the spectacular wildlife, stunning scenery, incredible beaches, amazing weather. Do go to the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney if you're there, because they've got the lots of early EMS stuff, because Tristram Carey ended up back in Australia, Don Banks obviously from Australia, so there's kind of a link with the Antipodes and EMS. And they've also got Fairlight stuff, so yeah, go to the Powerhouse Museum. Stop it! Stop not going there! Right, moving on. So the first sign that EMS might be taking this idea of selling things seriously crops up in the program for a subsequent electronic music performance, which mentions that EMS are selling something called the EMS Electronic Studio Mark I for 260 of your Earth pounds. Later that year, they had advanced to the prototype for the VCS3, this wonderful beast in the corner. Now, as you can see in the pictures appearing in front of your dazzled eyes, the VCS3 prototype looks an awful lot like the final thing. It's hand labelled. That's one of the more kind of attractive things about this. Rather, as I say, Wallace and Gromity operation was that things were hand labelled and made out of cardboard in some cases. But essentially, that's a VCS3. And by late 1969, the adverts to buy a Synthi VCS3 were appearing, 330 quid. And speaking of adverts, EMS, possibly of every synthesizer company that's ever existed, had the best adverts there have ever been, including the infamous Every Nun Needs a Synthi. Hopefully, again, these are flashing before your dazzled eyes and you can't see me sitting here waving my hand. But if you can, it's because we can't find them. Right, so the VCS3 was quite a big hit compared to the American competition of the day, really quite cheap. But despite the wonderful advertising, EMS were not the world's best people at marketing, so it sold okay. VCS3 was followed by the Synthi A. Synthi A is a great idea, which is, well, a VCS3 is wonderful, but they're really quite chunky big things. They're a nightmare to carry around to gigs. So they had the very simple idea, well, let's put it in a suitcase. It's got a front panel that kind of is already in an L shape, let's just have it shut. So if you get a Synthi A, it's in a very nice little black suitcase. You close it, you turn up, you open it, you play your gig. This was quickly followed by the Synthi AKS, and the K and the S stand for keyboard and sequencer, because finally you could get something from EMS with a keyboard built into it, because as I say, they weren't really that fond of equal tempered music. But sense did prevail, and they did actually make this machine finally with a built-in keyboard. But when I say sense prevailed, I only mean briefly, because the Synthi AKS was followed by one of the most monstrous, I don't even know what the word is, Godzilla-like behemoth, the Stonehenge of synthesis, the Synthi 100. I don't know if it's even going to fit on your screen. Synthi 100 was basically a bunch of VCS3s racked up together with a load of extra features, maybe a vocoder chucked in, a pin matrix that you could run a small city from. It had a, for the time, astonishingly incredible digital sequencer that could run multiple tracks, multiple steps. Truly, the Synthi 100 was the greatest synth ever built. It doesn't matter what anybody else tells you, they're wrong, they're lying. The fact that it's almost impossible to operate, really unreliable, doesn't matter. Look at it, just look at the Synthi 100. Look at the Synthi 100. Despite being the greatest synth ever made, unfortunately the Synthi 100 wasn't destined to repair the fortunes of EMS. They produced some other amazing pieces of kit that are still to this day amazing and unparalleled hi-fi effects unit, the Vocoder 5000, the astonishingly poorly received Polysynthi, an absolute disaster of a keyboard. At a time when everybody else was nailing really good polysynth, this one was straight out of 1846. It was appalling. But it did have a really, really garish and rotten colour scheme to make up for the fact that it was terrible as a keyboard. So that's alright. As well as these comparatively mass-market instruments, there were also further oddities and prototypes, a couple of different VCS4s, a data Synthi, a huge computer-controlled Synthi 100, and numerous more amazing items for Zinovjev's home studio, like a light pen before the Fairlight had it, some kind of touchable, squeezable interface, something called the Touch Me, Squeeze Me. The EMS studio really was a sort of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of insane analog. There is a fantastic little 30-minute documentary that gives even the slightest taste called What the Future Sounded Like. It has just great stories like David Cockerell telling about the time Peter Zinoviev asked him to record a fly screaming, and how he knocked together a sampler about 10 years before anybody else did, just so they could have one. Astonishing. Everybody who's ever worked there insists that the real story just can't be told because it's too insane. Unfortunately, it couldn't last. Ultimately, EMS went bankrupt, and tragically, the amazing EMS studio was taken apart, and Zinoviev was forced to take the offer of storage from the National Theatre in their basement, whereupon, a few years later, it was flooded and destroyed. So possibly one of the most visionary electronic studios of the 1960s is no more. So, to wrap things up, the EMS name passed through a few different owners after the initial bankruptcy and ended up in the hands of Robin Wood, who'd been an employee of the company in its various forms since 1970s. So from 1995, Robin Wood has been hand-making VCS3s and Synthi A's, and you put yourself onto the waiting list, and you waited, and in some cases waited longer than the longest Kickstarter ever, to see if you were actually going to get one. And it turns out that if you waited long enough, you did. Because over my shoulder is a 1990s VCS3. It's an utterly fabulous and incredible thing. It really, really is. The fact that Arturia have got something which brings most of those ideas and features onto your laptop for about 1/1000th the price is incredibly good news, because while that's great, it still really comes from an awkward to take it anywhere. I can't save presets, I can't do any of the tempo syncing thing that the Arturia thing can do. That said, I love it like a child, and I will beat people to death if they even sneeze on it. You might actually be wanting to have a play with one of these things rather than just sort of sitting here watching me tell you about them like a fond uncle about his favourite nephew. So I'm going to stop fondunkling. That's an interesting phrase to get wrong. I'm going to stop fondunkling. And you, my friend, are now my favourite nephew, and I am going to fonduncle you. We might cut this bit. But yes, I'm going to tell you all about how to use the Arturia Synthi V now.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content. And if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.